Hi, I'm Lauren Hollows, and this is Understand TAE's question of the week. And this week we are focusing on who to write practical assessments for. So when you're writing practical assessments, generally we've got multiple parties involved. We're writing them for auditors to make sure that we mention those keywords so that when our assessment tools are audited, we want to make sure that the auditor can kind of see those clear links. We are writing them for students so that students understand the assessments that they're going to be undertaking. From a fairness perspective, when we're looking at the principles of assessment, we need to make sure that students have got a clear understanding of the assessments that they're going to be undertaking and that the benchmarks they've got to demonstrate. This is where, auditor interpretations and student interpretations can be a little bit difficult because we're definitely writing for two different parties. Often one is very academic and the other one is maybe not so much. The last one that we're writing for is we're writing for the assessors. And when we write for the assessors, they need to understand how they're going to be rolling out the assessment. And in addition to that, they also need to have very clear benchmarks that they need to be looking for. So what are the observable behaviors? And what this boils down to is, obviously this is all around standard 1.8. And for those of you that have seen my shows before, you know that 1.8 is applying the principles of assessment, the rules of evidence, and the training package requirements. Specifically in relation to practical assessments, one of the non-compliances that continually comes back is that we are not creating observable behaviors. So an example of that is when we say the student acts in accordance with WHS. What does that look like? How does that, show itself in the tools themselves? So the way that we would write this for an auditor is often it gets written as student acts in accordance with WHS procedures. And what we do by that is we've linked some of those keywords to the performance criteria, 1.1, 1.2. Then we can sometimes write it for the assessors because generally when it's a practical assessment, we are assuming that it's the assessor that's actually observing the behaviors. And so, we may give some guidance in and around that, and we may put something to the effect of, so the students follows policies and procedures and acts in a safe manner. Okay. What we often miss out is the part where we're actually explaining to the student the benchmarks, and we're explaining to the students the behaviors that they're going to need to demonstrate. It's really difficult for people when they're writing practical assessments because often we don't want to give away too much to the student. However, we've got to remember that in the vast majority of these times, the students actually aren't going to have access to these tools. We're going to give them the broad task, and then there's a whole range of skills that they're going to have to demonstrate as part of that. And we need to, at some point, give the students that list of what they're actually going to have to demonstrate to us. So if we tell them, for example, that they need to make a cake or service an engine, or change a nappy, or any of those sorts of skills, that there is a range of sub-skills that we're going to be assessing them on throughout that process. We are going to be assessing them on how they work safely. We're going to be assessing them on how they're communicating with the client or with their co-workers. We're going to be assessing them on how well they follow the policies and procedures of the business. We're going to be assessing them on whether they are efficient and whether they are effective in the tasks, and how are we making that determination. So when we're writing for these three parties consistently. We're consistently writing to satisfy auditors, we're consistently writing to satisfy students, and we're consistently writing to satisfy assessors. So we've got to make sure that we can combine all of these three things. And often I'm asked, who do we need to write them for the most? And when we're dealing with curriculum developers, the curriculum developers are generally not subject matter experts all the time, particularly when it comes to writing assessments. So it can be really difficult to consistently satisfy all these audiences in a really valid way. My recommendation to RTOs is that first and foremost, when you're dealing with practical assessments, you need to be writing for the assessor. You need to be writing for the assessor in a way that the assessor is going to clearly understand how the entire task is going to work out. So when we're looking at the entire task, we're looking at things like, from woe to go, are we giving a really clear context to how this is going to happen? So if they, for example, need to demonstrate patisserie skills, what are the specific desserts that they're going to be creating? If we have to service an engine, what is the engine that we're going to be servicing, and what is the problem that we have to be identifying, or what are the sub tasks that need to fall within that. If we have to dig a trench, what is the depth of the trench, what kind of substance do we have to dig it in, what are all the contexts that we're going to be giving for these things, because often when we're writing in that performance evidence criteria, these are some of the things that we're missing out. We're also not giving enough information in relation to benchmarks. So, I'm going to give 3 examples. The first example is a really common one. Acts in accordance with WHS procedures. What does that look like from an observable behavior perspective? Okay. First, we're going to take into account the AQF level, all right, because what we expect of somebody working in an AQF 1 versus working at AQF 3 are going to be different. How well they follow policies and procedures, how well they identify risks, okay? Do they know where all of the manuals are? How well they service the equipment? Do they choose the correct PPE? All of these things are part of us determining whether somebody can act in accordance with WHS. When we talk about work effectively, this is another really common one that we consistently see. We see students communicates effectively. Okay, what does that look like? Again, at an AQF 1-2 level, communicating effectively is going to be very different than somebody who is expected to communicate effectively at an AQF 4 level. So from somebody dealing with an AQF 4 level, I expect them to have a much more acute understanding of their body language, of their tone of language, of the pace of their language, of using more correct grammar. Ironically. These are all of the kinds of things that we expect depending on the level, whereas when we're looking at somebody who's communicating effectively for AQF 1 and AQF 2, it may be more along the lines of that they can clearly understand instructions, that they can communicate their needs, and that they can ask basic questions. Okay? When we are looking at something like how well somebody effectively and efficiently works is another one. Effectively and efficiently for somebody who is entering into the industry versus effectively and efficiently for a manager. So we want to take all of these things into account, but ultimately they have to all come back to observable behaviors. When we give an observable behavior, as opposed to speaking in our vet speak, in our performance criteria language, what we do is we create a very clear benchmark for our assessor, because our assessor has something that they can see and something that they can hear that they know is going to actually meet that standard. When we create an observable behavior, we give the student a clear indicator of the kinds of behaviors that we are expecting them to demonstrate. Therefore, we're meeting our principle of assessment when it comes to fairness, okay? We can then translate that and we can write our mapping guides for our auditors, okay? Because we now work under the student audit model. And what the student audit model means is that when the auditors actually take all of this into context, it's going to be looking at completed student assessments. It's not going to be looking at an assessment tool as such. It will be looking at completed student assessments, and they are going to have the SMEs, they are going to have the assessors there to say, why did you make this decision and how does it link to the unit of competency? So when you write your practical assessments, write them for your assessors, write them for your students, and you are going to be far more likely to be creating compliant and quality assessment tools that are going to be delivered effectively and delivered in line with what they're supposed to be, in line with the units of competency. Then you train your assessors to speak in the language of the principles of assessment and rules of evidence, and they will be confident explaining how the assessments meets the unit criteria. Have your assessors continually and religiously checking back in with those units of competency, interpreting those criteria. If you are doing those 2 things, you are going to be an awful lot closer to creating practical assessments that are compliant and quality and that will be rolled out how they're supposed to be, and you will have students that are far more competent than if you start writing everything to satisfy auditors. We can write our mapping guides to satisfy auditors. We write our assessment tools to satisfy the users, and that is the students and the assessors. I hope you found this helpful. I look forward to seeing you next week, and I do apologize for the lateness, but I hope you all have a great Sunday. This is Lauren Hollows for Understand TAE.